In this session, we'll be hearing from Yann Louvel, political analyst at Reclaim Finance, and Heffa Schuecking, director of Urgewald.
So yeah, I'm very happy to join you because I have been tracking banks and the banks' policies for 10 years, first with BankTrack and now with Reclaim Finance. So I'm very happy to share some lessons with you on policy analysis in this session. And first, I wanted to just say, yeah, as Nicole introduced me, I am working now for Reclaim Finance. I moved from BankTrack to Reclaim Finance, and the first, it's a brand new NGO, and the first focus is to pressure French financial institutions to adopt good policies, but also to leverage the good practices at the international level. So that's why I'm very happy to be here today, and to also put pressure to the UK financial institutions that need a lot of pressure to get better policies. So what I will do in this presentation, I will present the best policy we have so far, first on coal, and then on oil and gas. So I will start with first coal, and this is table ranking of the banking on climate change report that we publish with our US partners at Rainforest Action Network in the US and many others every year. You see in that ranking that the best is Crédit Mutuel, French bank. So that is the one that I will present here, which contains almost all of the elements that must be in a good coal policy. And I will also use this opportunity to mention the loopholes that must be avoided in policies so that they really have an impact and they are not just announcements or greenwashing, which is of course what we want to avoid. First, a few words on Crédit Mutuel. You may not know that bank. It's a medium-sized French bank. They adopted already a few years ago a first policy which was quite basic and quite simple, but then very recently, last month in March, they adopted a way more comprehensive coal phase-out policy, and that's exactly what I will mention now on the different elements that are in that policy. There are 5 elements, but one comment to all of them, which is very important, is that for a policy to have an impact, it has to cover all the different parts of the coal value chain. So not only the coal mining part or not only the coal power part, but mining, power, and transport infrastructure, all the different elements that you see presented on that screen on the right. And for that, I would expect that you may have heard already in the past presentations about the global coal exit list. They mention and they present all those coal companies, not only mining or only power. So that is really a crucial point that applies everywhere in the policy. But to get to the different elements, the first element, which is the most obvious one when you hear about a bank, and that's the first thing that banks mention when they make some announcements, it's about direct financing of projects. It was also presented in earlier webinars and sessions. So really, first thing is to end the financing, the direct financing of new coal projects. And you see here, again, not only in the mines, but also the plants and infrastructure project. That's what is in the Crédit Mutuel policy. They stop all of this. But I would say that this is really the most the basic step. This is really the first obvious step. Then we get to the less obvious steps and the less obvious elements, which are about indirect financing. So corporate finance, when the bank finances not a specific project, but a company and all the activities of that company. So that's where for a policy to have an impact, we come to what kind of exclusion threshold, what kind of exclusion criteria do you need to have, and do banks need to adopt to exclude coal companies, and this is the first of the three kind of criteria of the global coal exit list that are in the Crédit Mutuel policy. It's the exclusion of what we call coal developers, which are those companies that are planning to build new coal mines, new coal plants, or new coal infrastructure. So this is basically here to not do, for the banks to not do indirectly what they have decided to stop directly. So, and this is also in a Crédit Mutuel policy from March this year. So as of now, they exclude the more than 100 coal developer companies. The third one, and the second exclusion criteria, also very important, is the relatively highly exposed companies exposed to coal. There is two ways to do so. For mining and infrastructure companies, it's the coal share of revenue that we look at. So as soon as a company has more than 20% of their revenues coming from coal, they are blacklisted. And the equivalent on the power side, we prefer to use a coal share of power production, which is closer to the concrete climate impact rather than revenues. As soon as a company has a lot of its activities in coal, then it is blacklisted, it is excluded. You have still some companies that are so big that they're, even if they mine a lot of coal, or if they produce a lot of electricity from coal, it still represents only a small part, a small share of their activity. That's why we have this element here, full exclusion of big coal companies, and the criteria that are being used are, or any company that has more than 10 million tons of annual coal production, or any company that has more than 5 gigawatts of coal power installed capacity is also excluded, again, even if it's a small share of their activity. So just to mention a few of the loopholes for the criteria that I just mentioned that you can find in some policies, and that it's not the case for Crédit Mutuel, and that really needs to be avoided. You have some of those criteria that are applied only for new clients. So that's a big issue, because it's easier for a bank to adopt this for only new clients and not existing clients. And another one is when it is applied only to part of their activities, only for lending, but not the issuance of new shares and bonds. Or another one that you have at the project level, to go back at the project level, is when it's not for globally, when you have some countries where the policy does not apply. I'm thinking here of the HSBC policy for projects. They have a loophole for Indonesia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. So that's of course a big issue. And I will end for coal with the last element. Element number 5, make sure that the bank has a full coal phase-out strategy, and there are 2 elements that are important here. The first one is to have the right deadline. Crédit Mutuel actually on that one goes even further than what you see written here. They have a commitment for 2030, but in terms of science, climate analytics recommends 2030 for the EU and the OECD, and 2040 globally. So you have more and more banks that have such policies. And the other important element is that the bank requests companies to publish a coal closure plan, closure and not selling, aligned with these deadlines, or exclude them. That's what Crédit Mutuel is doing. They will exclude from next January any company that has not published a coal closure plan aligned with end by 2030. That is for coal. On the oil and gas part, it's less advanced than the coal part. So what I will present here, I go back to the Banking on Climate Change report. I will present the BNP Paribas policy. You see here that this is the best policy so far, but it only covers, it's a very important point, unconventional oil and gas and not conventional oil and gas. So there is still a lot to be done on the oil and gas side of things, but at least on the unconventional oil and gas, BNP Paribas is a way bigger player than Crédit Mutuel. It's a major global French bank. It was targeted by a strong campaign in 2017. And at the end of that year, the bank adopted a policy for unconventional oil and gas. And I will present 3 elements of that policy. The first element is on tar sands and shale oil or gas. What they do here is that they end the direct financing for projects, including pipelines. It can be very important, particularly in North America, given the tar sands ongoing fights. And they also exclude at the corporate level companies that have significant reserves or revenues from tar sands or shale oil or gas. They also have this corporate level exclusion. That is actually the same logic that applies for the Arctic, exactly the same logic, end of direct finance for projects including pipelines and exclusion of companies with the same metrics. Some policies are also problematic because they use different definition of what is the Arctic. I won't get into the details, but there is this kind of small changes and small modifications that can also change the impact of a policy. So every detail is quite important. And the last element on oil and gas, that one is quite rare among the banks. There are quite a few policies on tar sands and Arctic, but on LNG way less. So this is what BNP Paribas does. They end the direct financing for LNG export terminals in North America because it is linked to shale gas. And I will just finish with this last, just an announcement. This is something we are working on and we will publish in a few weeks from now. We call it the call policy tool. It will be only on call at the beginning. And it will be a tool, an online tool. I extracted here the draft version that we have right now with the UK banks you will be interested in. It will be a table that makes it easy to assess the call policies of international financial institutions based on the 5 elements that I presented in this presentation, with color coding and scores from 0 to 10. You can see here that there is a lot to be done on the UK banks to reach the Crédit Mutuel policies that I just described in this session. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Yann has talked about what a good bank policy looks like, and I'm going to talk about how we get there in the first place. I want to present 7 lessons for successful finance campaigns. So if you want to win a finance campaign, probably the first thing you need to do is change the way you think about the finance industry. We're all used to thinking about the finance industry as an incredibly powerful entity. And this is also the image that the industry, of course, likes to cultivate for itself through its huge bank towers and astronomical salaries for top bank management. To be an effective finance campaigner, you need to realize that all of this masters of the universe stuff, it's just an illusion. For campaigning purposes, it's best to think about the finance industry like this: a relatively uninformed group with strong herd behavior. And the easiest way to move this herd is to pick the right target animals. Get them to move and the herd will follow. But careful, you can't just pick the biggest animal. You also need to consider which animals you actually can move. So it's useful to take a close look at the possibilities. Lesson number 2, putting a face on the fossil fuel investments of financial institutions is incredibly powerful. You shouldn't forget that people at finance institutions are often very disconnected from the real world impacts of their decisions. Traders and investment bankers often just look at numbers and profit margins and operate in a kind of computer-generated virtual reality. You, of course, also need to know your numbers and should be able to talk about the size of a financial institution's fossil fuel investments. But really, a key element of successful campaigning is connecting the dots for financial institutions on what their specific investments are doing in the real world and how they're destroying the real world. I'll give you an example. In 2014, Urgewald decided that we wanted to run a campaign on the Norwegian government pension fund. The Norwegian government pension fund is the world's second largest pension fund. Norway itself doesn't have a coal industry. So in contrast to, say, Germany or Poland, people in Norway don't have any experience of what open pit coal mining looks like. One of the most important things we did in that campaign was to show the pension fund's managers, Norwegian parliamentarians, and the public photos of what their money was invested in. These were not generic photos. These were photos of the coal operations of specific companies in the pension fund's portfolio. Companies like Coal India, or companies like Duke Energy from the United States that has been convicted on several counts for criminal pollution. We showed them before and after pictures of what their investments in mountaintop removal companies in the United States look like. Anybody who's ever been to Norway knows that Norwegians love being outdoors. They all go hiking or skiing or sailing or kayaking, and they love the nature in their own country. And if you show a Norwegian a photo like this where the mountaintops have been blown off, they're completely shocked. I honestly had people who had tears in their eyes asking me, "You mean we're really invested in this?" Photos are an important tool to make these investments real for people working in financial institutions or making decisions. We, however, went a step further. We also worked together with Norwegian NGOs to organize a hearing in the Norwegian Parliament, which sets the standards for the pension fund. And at this hearing, people from 6 different regions of the world who are affected by the operations of coal companies that the pension fund was invested in testified. Up until today, the Norwegian coal divestment of 8 billion euros, it's the largest coal divestment action that has happened worldwide. Lesson number 3, it's good to create a race to the top dynamic among financial institutions. Now, anyone who's ever attended a school knows that peer groups can have a huge influence on us. Allianz and AXA are 2 of the world's largest insurance companies, and they are close competitors. AXA is headquartered in France, and Allianz is headquartered in Germany, but both are really global players. Now, in 2015, AXA was the first insurance company to move and adopted a coal revenue threshold of 50% to cut coal companies out of its portfolio. We immediately called on Allianz saying, look, if AXA can do this, why can't you? So 6 months later, Allianz took its first divestment step, and because they wanted to be better also than AXA, they used a coal revenue threshold of 30% to divest companies. We worked closely with NGO colleagues in France who then went back to AXA and said, look, if Allianz can do 30%, surely you can do better. This in 2017 then led AXA to take new measures, by which time we went back to Allianz. This kind of dynamic is very, very powerful. And today, Allianz and AXA are among, in terms of large financial institutions, have some of the the best policies on coal. Lesson number 4 is about picking the right moment. While AXA Allianz and other insurance companies were already moving forward, an insurer called Hannover Re from Germany, who's actually one of the world's largest reinsurers, at Urgewald, we were thinking about, well, what should we do about this? And at that time, December 2018, we decided to do nothing and simply waited, because we knew that in April 2019, a new CEO was coming in for Hannover Re. And we figured that this was the right moment for an effective campaign. Campaigning is also about efficiency. So what we did in April 2019, when the new CEO came in, what you see here is basically billboard posters and advertisements that were all over Hanover, especially around the offices of Hannover Re, at the train station, other places. And they all say, Hannover Re, give our climate a chance, stop insuring coal. P.S. Your peers have already done this. And that was probably the shortest campaign we ever ran. Within 4 weeks, Hannover Re said, okay, we're adopting a new policy to stop insuring coal. Now, there are also other type of right moments. And right now in the UK, for UK financial institutions, this is a good time to campaign on them, because in the run-up to the next COP in Glasgow, this is a moment where truly much more public attention will be paid to the issue, and where financial institutions in the UK will be under much more international scrutiny than at any other time. Lesson number 5 is be realistic and radical at the same time. The place where we need to get to is divestment of all fossil fuels. We want to cut off cash flows to all of these industries. The reality, however, is that investors and banks, they mostly only move one step at a time. And our job is to make sure that those steps are big and quick enough. Lesson number 6, don't stop if the job is only half done. I can't stress how important this is. If a bank reacts to a campaign by issuing a policy that really doesn't do much, you need to keep on campaigning. If a bank doesn't move at all and you decide to give up a campaign after 6 months, all that the bank will learn from this is that they can sit things out. Once you really hone in on a campaign target, you need to get the job done, and you need to show the persistence of a pit bull terrier. And in the long run, this also really pays off, because when financial institutions realize that campaigns are not just going to go away, they will have to react. And you'll see that from time to time, campaign to campaign, the reaction time will become quicker. Part of that persistence means campaigning is not only about getting a good policy, it's also about making sure that that policy is implemented. Even the best policy is no good without implementation. And that means that once a policy is there, it needs to be monitored in order to see, is the financial institution, is the bank actually applying it? Now, that's something where organizations like but our research can only have an impact if there are campaigning groups who are taking this on and making it an issue in the public. Lesson number 7, the last lesson, reputational risk is really our strongest weapon in campaigning on financial institutions. This can mean doing public actions in front of banks. It can mean, if you're a student, going to banks and saying, I would never be willing to work for your company because you're on the wrong side of the climate battle. It can mean publicly cutting up your bank credit card. It can mean joining other bank customers and doing it together. This is a photo from Australia where customers of ANZ, one of the big Australian banks, lined up to all go in and withdraw their money and change their account together to show the bank that they do not want to be invested in an institution that is investing against their future. At the end of the day, reputational risk, it's us. And we're looking forward to supporting whatever amazing campaigning activities come out in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heffa and Yann. I've got a very first question, I think for you, Heffa. How did the coal industry react when you started putting a face on the fossil fuel industry and the destructive impact it has?
All of a sudden, there were a lot of coal lobbyists visiting Norway during our campaign, this we have to realize, we're campaigning, there's always the other side too, and they have their own way of campaigning. And, but you can't really argue with, with the facts in a way. And if you're able to show the facts, the reality of what the coal industry is doing in so many places in the world, if they're testimonies of people, the coal industry doesn't really have a chance.
Then there's another question for Yann, I'd say, but maybe also for Heffa. How can we make sure that when a bank adopts a policy, how can we make sure they actually follow that policy?
It's a very good question. The only way to do so is to really be able to analyze their activity. So that's why we don't only track their policies and score their policies, but we also very regularly publish with partners every year some reports on the financing of those banks with different list of companies, but we regularly check what banks are financing and which projects. And of course, we make public when there is a clear violation of their policy, and we use also the financing that is remaining to show that the policies don't go far enough. So that's also very important to be able to track the financial flows and not only stay at the policy level.
Can you give any concrete examples of loopholes in policies that UK banks have adopted?
Absolutely. I already mentioned one in the presentation, but it's important to repeat it here because it's a famous one, big one, the one from HSBC on the 3 countries exceptions for their project. It's only the project level exclusion. So there is a loophole for Indonesia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. So I liked the way they presented it. It was exclusion all over the world except in those 3 countries, but when you dig a bit you realize that those 3 countries are actually among the ones that have the biggest expansion plans and that rely on foreign funding. So these are basically the biggest markets where they could continue to make some deals. So that's a very important one. To mention 2 other ones, there is Lloyd's, for instance. Lloyd's has that loophole. They exclude companies above 30%, which is in itself a good threshold, but a big but, only for new clients, not for existing clients. So that's a big loophole to avoid. And the last example I will mention would be, it's a different kind of loophole, but Standard Chartered adopted recently a new policy. It's the principle to lower the threshold over time is a good one, but the way they do it is a loophole because they wait 5 years from now, they wait 2025 to go from 100% to 60%, which is far from enough. So, and they only end at 10% in 2030. which is not enough for us. We want them to go down to a maximum 5%. So you see they use a good principle, but it's not quick enough, and they save time a few years before reaching only the 60%. So those are two other loopholes that I would mention.
On the contrary, are there any examples of good policies or good parts of a policy that a British bank has adopted?
Well, there is no exception on the on country level for the other UK banks, as far as I remember. That there were no policy at all or until not that long ago. But apart from HSBC, now they have closed. They have adopted new policies. The other UK banks. So we are left only with HSBC and this three country loophole.
In your campaigns, do you only focus on thermal coal used in coal power plants, for example, or do you also look at coal used for steel production?
Right now, we're focusing on thermal coal because you can say thermal coal is not needed, period. With metallurgical coal for steel making, it's a little bit more difficult. There are already alternative ways of making steel, but it's more about the efficiency of the steel plants would be the campaign, or the CO2 emissions of the steel plants. And we're focusing on cleaning up the thermal coal question first. That's next, but it's a different kind of campaign because you're mainly you're putting pressure on the steel makers, or you're putting pressure on the financial institutions to expect more in terms of CO2 reduction from the steel makers. I just maybe wanted to add something on sort of the question to Yann before. I actually think the most exciting UK bank policy on coal is Royal Bank of Scotland, who are using a 15% threshold in terms of coal mining and exclusion of coal mining and exclusion of coal power projects. And I think that's a good place also to use the race to the top dynamic I mentioned before, because there's actually already one UK bank that has gone a lot further in terms of cutting out corporate lending to coal companies.
RBS also, on the oil and gas side, they have adopted a policy that looks very interesting. They are asking companies, even conventional oil and gas companies, the big ones, to adopt Paris-aligned plans, or they will stop finance them. The big question now in discussion is, what is a Paris-aligned plan for oil and gas companies? They are working on this, so it could be great if the answer is good. It could be a new loophole to avoid if the answer is bad. But very, very interesting new policy from RBS indeed. They are still, for most of them, at the project level, even if they don't actually do a lot of project financing. They not many of them have adopted the exclusion, the full exclusion without loopholes at the project level. There was an announcement already, again, very recently this week on Tuesday from Citi that they were stopping globally the project. On the company, on the corporate level, it's only the beginning. It's only the beginning. I need to look at the details of the new Citi policy. I think they have a new threshold for 25%, but I need to dig the details. But it's really the whole idea for the US banks, and actually also for many others until recently, the whole idea to exclude and to blacklist any kind of companies was the issue itself, without even talking about what kind of threshold to use. The whole concept was problematic, so that's why it took a lot of time and a lot of campaign to start to get there, and it's again only the beginning. So that's what I can say on the positive side. On the negative side, I don't really have those that have not adopted yet the full project exclusion would be the negative side. There are only Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and now Citi that have adopted that global exclusion, 3. So you have still left Morgan Stanley, Bank of America at least, but yeah, only the beginning.
If you look at the picture overall, policy-wise, you could say that the most progressive banks right now, in terms at least of fossil fuel policies, are in mainland Europe. The US it's like a whole different picture. I mean, JP Morgan Chase, they're moving so slow. JP Morgan Chase came out and finally said, we will exclude financing for new coal projects, but actually they haven't done direct project financing for new coal plants over the past 20 years. Like, you know, they're no really corporate level, haven't been corporate level exclusions up to now. Now that train is starting to move. The UK banks are kind of in between the US and mainland Europe, I would say, just in terms of the overall picture.
Now we've talked about the Norwegian government pension fund. We've also talked about other banks. Does it make a difference to your approach to campaigning, Heffa, whether you campaign against a state-owned company, for example, or a state-owned pension fund, or whether you campaign against a private bank?
Yeah, it makes a big difference. It's actually usually much harder to move banks than to move investors, because investors are not making a business sacrifice. On the contrary, if investors pull their money out of coal or pull their money out of oil and gas, probably their portfolio is actually going to do better. They're not saying no to profit or returns. But if a bank decides to not give loans anymore to clients from fossil fuel industry in the short term, this means a business sacrifice. And it's something that banks are not going to do on their own, and that only works if there's sufficient public pressure there. And to make it work quickly enough, we need policies. You need to establish rules. Otherwise, those individual deals are just going to keep on going through.
I think that's a really great word to end the discussion here. I just wanted to say a few words myself, because we've been getting a few comments saying that Urgewald's website is mainly in German and they can't really find any in-depth information. We're currently actually changing that. So if you go onto the English Urgewald website now, you will find our entire campaign against Barclays, HSBC and Standard Chartered with more in-depth information. We're still extending that, so it's coming. On that note, I would like to say thank you, Heffa, and thank you, Yann, so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed the session.